30 years ago, Sunday band concerts in the park were standard fare in hundreds of towns across the United States. Salt Lake City is one of the few remaining places where the municipal band plays the same old music in the park on summer Sunday afternoons. I'd like to believe that the band persists here because its historical roots are deeper in Utah than in most parts of the country. The Mormons had a brass band in Nauvoo, led by English convert William Pitt, which stayed intact during the flight west, continuing to cheer the saints all the way to the Salt Lake Valley. Thomas L. Kane has left us this account of the impression their music gave along the valley of the Platte.
Some of their wind instruments indeed were uncommonly full and pure-toned, and in that clear, dry air could be heard to a great distance. It had had the strangest effect in the world to listen to their sweet music winding over the uninhabited country. The wind rising would bring you the first faint thought of a melody, and as you listened, borne down upon the gust that swept past you a cloud of the dry, sifted sands, you recognized it. Perhaps a home-loved theme of Henry Proch or Mendelssohn. Imagine Mendelssohn Bartholdy way out there in the Indian marches.
The harmony of the various instruments seemed to express a fundamental tenet of cultural life in early Mormon Utah. Cultural expression by these people was to be community expression, that of the group or ensemble, not of the individual. And in addition, Pitt's band was to become a symbol of cheerful determination in the most depressing of circumstances. It may well be that the Sunday public concerts are still supported in Salt Lake City because they stir dim memories in some of the people of a time when their ancestors had a band to cheer them, but precious little else. William Pitt's Nauvoo Brass Band was by no means the only instrumental ensemble in early Utah. In the 1850s, Domenico Ballo was converted by missionaries and shortly thereafter came to Salt Lake City. Ballo had studied at the Milan Conservatory and directed the West Point Band. He organized both a band and an orchestra in Salt Lake City. His orchestra performed Haydn symphonies for Utah audiences when the territory was barely out of the pioneering stage. Camp Floyd and Fort Douglas likewise had bands in the late 1850s and the 60s, both for parade and recreational purposes. Band music of the time varied, offering arrangements of hymns, popular songs of the day, patriotic songs, and light classical music, including the Mendelssohn, which so impressed Colonel Kane on the plains. The Pitt and Ballo bands played frequently for public holidays. Typical was the report of the 1856 4th of July celebration.
The bands, under the direction of Major William Pitt, played at the residences of Governor Young, Honorable H.C. Kimball, and Lieutenant General D.H. Wells, after which all the Nauvoo Brass Band, mounted on Ballos and Marshall bands in omnibuses, passed through the principal streets discoursing beautiful and harmonious strains of music.
The tradition was reinforced in later decades when several of the early communities such as Eureka, Tintic, and Silver Reef supported town bands at various times. Utah's first full-fledged orchestra was organized in 1877 by Anton Pedersen, a native of Norway. His symphony lasted but a few years and was succeeded at intervals by several different organizations until the present Utah Symphony was founded in 1940. Choral music in Utah began almost upon the arrival of the Mormons, though I suspect the mountain men some 2 decades earlier had rent the air at rendezvous and winter camps with many a salty tune. Choral performances in the earliest pioneer period were part of church services and held in this structure, the Bowery. I suppose it might be appropriate to call the fledgling organization, first directed by John Perry, the Mormon Bowery Choir. Perry continued to conduct after the choir moved into this squat adobe Greek Revival building, the old Tabernacle. Several conductors succeeded him until 1867 when the choir moved into the new Tabernacle, now well over a century old, which still graces Temple Square. After that time, the choir was directed by a series of conductors trained in the finest European conservatories, including Charles J. Thomas, George Careless, and Ebenezer Beasley. In 1929, the choir began regular weekly network radio broadcasts, which have continued to the present. It's perhaps the only church choir to have become an American institution, producing several hit records. The Tabernacle Choir, in rehearsal tonight, remains one of the 2 or 3 most widely recognized symbols of Mormon Utah, and rightly so. Its several hundred members from different backgrounds and conditions in life express themselves as a unified, harmonious whole, the epitome of Mormon cultural achievement. This building, built by the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, is a replica of the old Salt Lake Theater. Here on the University of Utah campus is another building which honors the Salt Lake Theater in its design. The inspiration for both was once one of the famous cultural landmarks of the West. It was built in 1861-62, long before the completion of the railroad, as a community enterprise. The workers often accepted tithing scrip or promises of tickets to future performances as pay. The fact that 2 buildings in Salt Lake City were built to honor it indicates how important a cultural institution the Salt Lake Theater was. But Utah's first dramatic performances were held like those of the first choirs and bands in the Bowery on Temple Square. A play called The Triumph of Innocence was presented there in 1849. The next year, a musical and dramatic company was organized, moving its performances in 1852 to the old Social Hall, which once stood, appropriately enough, on Social Hall Avenue between South Temple and First South at State Street in Salt Lake City. This splendid replica was built at Pioneer Trails State Park in 1980. The Social Hall housed musical performances, balls, receptions, and theatrical productions until superseded by the Salt Lake Theater in 1862. The Deseret Dramatic Association maintained an ambitious repertory schedule, in some seasons performing 3 times a week such productions as Othello, Pizarro, and The Merchant of Venice. The theater became one of the most popular cultural activities in Utah. Box offices took scrip as well as cash, and even payments in kind, eggs, chicken, or wheat. Mormons and non-Mormons joined in presenting and patronizing the plays. A typical program began with the prayer, followed by a long, serious work. The evening was brought to a lively end by a short comedy or farce. After completion of the railroad, notable actors and actresses played in the Salt Lake Theater while on tour. The theater was rivaled in popularity only by dancing. In fact, the Salt Lake Theater was designed so its orchestra seats could be covered by a spring floor to form a large dance hall. Richard Burton, a non-Mormon visitor, commented in 1862 that
dancing seems to be an edifying exercise. The prophet dances, the apostles dance, the bishops dance.
Most holidays ended with the grand ball, which often continued until 2 or 3 in the morning. Square dances like the Virginia Reel were the usual fare, though an occasional risque round dance such as the waltz was permitted as the century wore on. Utah architects through the years have borrowed and adapted a number of styles for both public and domestic buildings, leaving a heritage rich in variety with several truly outstanding structures. Peter Goss of the University of Utah School of Architecture is going to show us some of the styles and distinctive features of several of Utah's finer buildings.
Dean, I think most people would agree that the Utah State Capitol is one of our finest examples of public architecture. It's a combination of the neoclassical revival style and the Renaissance revival style. It sits here on the brow of the hill on termination point of State Street, and it was designed by Richard Kletting in about 1914. It's a reinforced concrete frame with a granite veneer over that. I think it has a very fine proportion to the horizontal mass and then the vertical emphasis of the drum and dome capped by a lantern. St. Mark's Cathedral was built circa 1870, and it was designed by Richard Upjohn, one of the country's leading architects of ecclesiastical architecture. St. Mark's is in the Gothic Revival style and built of red butte sandstone. It contains a series of sandstone buttresses around the building. The building is a Latin cross plan. The windows, including the rose window on the facade and the pointed arch side windows, were built by the Tiffany Glass Company of New York City. The First National Bank of 1871 on Main Street is the only remaining intact commercial building erected in Utah prior to Brigham Young's death in 1877. It is designed by New York architect Richard Upjohn, the same architect of St. Mark's Cathedral. The original design contained a fourth floor under a mansard roof, which was destroyed in a fire in 1875 and replaced by a flat roof atop a third story. The building is notable for its very fine cast iron facade, predating the cast iron facade of ZCMI by 4 years. The George Badley House, built circa 1871, is an example of the pioneer vernacular style. This rectangular house, situated broadside to the street, is 1 room deep or wide and is one type that is quite common to the pioneer period. It was probably constructed of adobe and is covered with stucco. The building has a central entry separating 2 rooms. The gable roof is of a slight pitch with a plain molded cornice. It should be noted that the classical portico at the entry is a later addition. This substantial 2-story residence in the Italianate style is a Lewis S. Hills house constructed in 1884. This example is typical of the style. You should note the box-like massing, the low-hipped roof, broad front porch, and the wide bracketed eaves. The Hill House is a notable example with its bay window, cut stone coins at the corners, and pedimental lintels of cut stone over the windows. The George Arbuckle House of 1890 is a late example of the Gothic Revival style, particularly popular for residences such as this small cottage of brick. Other Utah examples were also built of wood and adobe brick. The features which make this building particularly notable as an example of Gothic Revival include the following: steeply pitched roofs, multiple gables, corbelled brick pointed arches, tall narrow windows, projecting bay windows, and steeply pitched cross gables. The Elliott Best House of 1893 is a delightful Queen Anne cottage designed by the Salt Lake architectural firm of Monheim, Proudfoot, and Bird. The style was derived from the work of the English architect Richard Norman Shaw and became one of the most popular styles of Victorian America. The house depicts the typical features of the cottage variation of the style. It is an all-wooden frame building containing an asymmetrical facade. Notice the variety of building materials, and in this instance, various combinations of decorative wall shingles, lathe-turned ornament, and scroll-cut woodwork.
This brief overview gives us a glimpse of the cultural opportunities available to city dwellers, those in Salt Lake, Ogden, or Provo. If you had been in any of these growing towns in the pre-railroad days, you could have taken in a theater performance, a band or choral concert, perhaps a dance, or attended any number of debating or philosophical society meetings. But what if you lived here in Parowan, 2 weeks away from Salt Lake City, about as remote a town as one could hope to find? After all, in 1870, 4 out of 5 Utahns lived in towns just like this. Without radio, TV, or movie houses, how did these people spend their leisure time? The answer is really quite surprising. They spent their time in almost exactly the same way that people in the city did, going to band and choral concerts, to theatricals or rollicking dances. Now, the quality of cultural activity available to those in the country was in most cases greatly inferior to that in the city, but the content was the same. Moreover, what was lost in quality may well have been made up for in opportunity to participate. For example, the Springville Band was among 6 which performed at a celebration in Big Cottonwood Canyon on the 24th of July in 1857. At the time, Springville had no more than 1,000 inhabitants. The town of Parowan, population 861 in 1870, had a string band and a brass band, both under the able direction of Thomas Durham. William Bickley led musical endeavors in Beaver. Joseph Coslett in Cedar City. John McFarlane in St. George. And David Edward in tiny Paraguna. These towns had bands a decade or more before the general enthusiasm for brass bands swept the rest of the United States. Choirs were likewise organized in most settlements. The Parowan and Cedar City choirs for years had an intense rivalry. So tough did the competition between churches for choral talent become that one Cache Valley bishop advertised
10 acres of the best land in the settlement for a good bass, tenor, and soprano, who are good members of society and good readers of music, and would settle in Mendon and attend meetings regularly.
Towns in many parts of Utah likewise had dramatic societies shortly after their founding, many meeting in the town opera house, such as these in Brigham City and Tooele. Both Parowan and Cedar City had drama societies functioning in the 1850s. The Cedar City Society had 61 members, a high proportion of the adults in the town. During this period, they produced a farce, Box and Cox, which had premiered in London only a few years earlier, in 1847. The University of Utah Department of Theater has prepared for us an excerpt. In the play, a landlady, Mrs. Bouncer, has been collecting double rent by letting the same room to a hatter, Mr. Cox, who works days, and a printer, Mr. Box, who works nights. In this scene, the inevitable meeting between the two renters occurs.
Come in if it's you, Mrs. Bouncer. You needn't be afraid. I wonder how long I've been asleep.
Oh, goodness gracious, my bacon!
Hello. What's this? A chop? Whose chop? Mrs. Bouncer's, I'll be bound. She thought to cook her breakfast while I was asleep. And with my coals, too, and my gridiron. Ha! Where's my bacon? Here it is. Well, upon my life, Bouncer's going it, and shall I curb my indignation? Shall I falter in my vengeance? No!
So much for Bouncer's breakfast. And now for my own.
I may as well lay on my breakfast things. Come in! Come in! Oh my goodness, my chop! Hello, what's this? The bacon again! Confound it, dash it, damn it! I can't stand this!
What?
Who are you, sir?
If you come to that, who are you, sir?
What are you doing here, sir? If you come to that, what are you doing? It's the printer. It's the hatter. Go to your attic, sir! Your attic, sir? My attic, sir? Printer, I shall do you frightful injury if you do not leave my apartment. Your apartment? You mean my apartment, you contemptible hatter, you?
Your apartment. Good, I like that. Look here, sir, Mrs. Bouncer's receipt for the last week's rent.
Ditto, sir.
Thieves! Murder! Mrs. Bouncer!
What is the matter?
Immediately remove that hatter. Instantly remove the printer.
But gentlemen...
Explain! Explain. Whose room is this? Yes, woman, whose room is this? Doesn't it belong to me?
No!
Yes, sir, you see, it belongs to me.
No! It belongs to both of you!
Both of us?
Oh, please don't be angry, gentlemen. But I thought, this gentleman being home during the day, and this gentleman at night, I might venture until my little back second-floor room is ready.
When will your little back second floor room be ready?
Why, tomorrow!
I'll take it.
So will I.
Excuse me, but if you both take it, you may as well just stop where you are.
True. I spoke first, sir. With all my heart, sir. The little back second floor room is yours, sir. Now go. Go? Pooh!
quarrel.
Don't quarrel, gentlemen. You see, there used to be a partition here.
Then put it up.
No, I shall go right away and see if I can't get that room ready this very day. Now do keep your tempers.
What a disgusting position.
If you will allow me to observe, if you've not had any exercise today, you had better go out and take it.
I shall do nothing of the sort, sir.
Very well, sir.
Very well, sir. However, don't prevent me from letting you go out.
Don't flatter yourself, sir. Hello, that's my role, sir.
More serious plays were presented, usually on the same program. But this excerpt gives us an accurate idea of the light side of Utah theater in the 1850s. The pace of activity in Deseret was worlds away from the drab loneliness Oliver H. Kelly observed at the time on farmsteads elsewhere in the United States. Kelly organized the Grange in 1867, partly to provide a social life for isolated farm families. This need wasn't felt in Utah, mainly because of the unusual layout of the early Mormon towns. Church leaders insisted that houses be built together in the typical rectangular surveyed town, surrounding a square set aside for the church house and other public buildings. Following a tradition begun by Joseph Smith in his plan for the city of Zion, the fields were outside of the town in contiguous plots. The men traveled each day from their home in town to their fields in the outskirts. Church leaders were acutely conscious of the social consequences of such a settlement pattern. They pointed out in an 1882 letter the many advantages of a social and civic character which might be lost, misapplied, or frittered away by spreading out so thinly that intercommunication is difficult, dangerous, inconvenient, and expensive. But there was a closeness to life in the small Mormon town of the period that some found oppressive. It was difficult to be a dissenter and to go one's own way. Individual expression was, in the Mormon view, suspect, and community achievement more highly prized than individual achievement. And this may explain why we've not said much about painting, sculpture, or creative writing in discussing cultural life in early Utah. The fact is that less creative work was accomplished in these areas, and that says worlds about the fundamental values of the society. The group activities of music, in band and choirs, of theater, and of dancing were highly prized in early Utah at the expense of the lonely achievement of the painter, the writer, or the sculptor. The lone individual or eccentric could not help being uncomfortable in Zion. I don't mean to imply, however, that there were no fine artists in early Utah. William W. Major, an accomplished painter, came to Utah in 1848. But his brief Utah career, painting mainly portraits and a few landscapes, ended when he left the territory in 1853. We've drawn extensively from the historical canvases of C.C.A. Christensen, a Danish-trained painter. But he made his living painting inspiring and faith-promoting scenes in Mormon church history, turning his art into sermons. Excellent work was done by Daniel A. Vegeland of Norway, though his talents were mainly employed in the painting of sets for the Salt Lake Theater and scenes in Mormon temples and meeting houses. George M. Ottinger also worked extensively with historical representations, portraits, and landscapes. Landscape painting played a lesser role in Utah art, however, until in the 1890s the church sponsored study in Paris for John Hafen, Loris Pratt, and John Fairbanks, who then returned to devote their considerable talents to painting church scenes and adorning interiors of Latter-day Saint temples. Alfred Lamborn and H.L.A. Colmer were also prominent landscape artists of this later period, emphasizing the romantic qualities of Utah landscapes in a style worthy of Albert Bierstadt or Thomas Moran. Early photographers Marcina Cannon, Charles W. Carter, Charles Savage, and George Anderson did excellent work, often recording important events, as well as everyday scenes in Utah folk life. Their bread and butter, however, was portraiture, as it's always been for all but a few photographers. There were few writers in early Utah, if one accepts the verses of such notables as Parley P. Pratt, Eliza R. Snow, Hannah Tapfield King, or Sarah Elizabeth Carmichael. Most of their work was devotional poetry, often set to music to become part of the rich repertoire of Mormon hymnody. Newspapers and magazines were published wherever opportunity permitted, including even the manuscript newspapers we've noted. The Union Vedette, Utah's first daily, served the military and non-Mormon community in Salt Lake City. Peep a Day, for a time, served the literary set in the capital. But early Utah newspapers, for the most part, served to teach and communicate, and were not literary in aim. The only well-known early sculpture was the eagle carved in 1859 by Ralph Ramsey to adorn the entrance to Brigham Young's estate. Mahanrai Young, a native son, moved elsewhere to practice his considerable talents as sculptor. Cultural life in Deseret then was rich, ambitious, and advanced, considering the poverty of the people and the stage of settlement they lived in. I'm not at all sure it wasn't on the whole more conducive to thought and creative energy than our more passive present-day consumption of slick television and flawless professional musical and theatrical performances. It was a rural as well as an urban phenomenon, and indeed involved a greater proportion of the country than of the city people. It did tend, however, to favor group over individual accomplishment and the performing arts over the fine arts. The direct influence of Europe, especially Great Britain, was extremely important in the cultural life of Utah as in the economic life, making local band and choral organizations almost an institution here before they'd even reached many parts of the United States. Finally, there was one aspect of cultural life in Utah that was fully democratic, open to city dwellers and country folk, to the socially prominent and the unknown, the schooled and the illiterate. This was participation in ceremonies of the Mormon temples. There, the devout Mormon, and this included a high proportion of early Utahns, was taken by means of dramatic techniques on a richly symbolic journey through space and time, designed to communicate clearly man's origins and ultimate promised destiny. Dressed alike in simple, unadorned vestments, Mormons of every class participated in ceremonies which promised to all a glorious celestial future, contingent only upon faithfulness and right living. And the furnishings and appointments of the temple interiors brought home to men who lived in humble adobe cottages the promised beauty of an exalted life. This was the People's Theater, participated in by far more Utahns than any of the public cultural offerings, and communicating more deeply because of the sanctity attached to it. I've no doubt that poor men and women came away from these services no longer content with dirt floors and stick furniture, determined henceforth to uplift their lives and attempt to approximate at home the celestial style of life they had glimpsed in the temple. If it seems strange to see the most sacred Mormon ceremonies as part of cultural life in Deseret, I would plead that in doing so, I'm only trying to see the world as they would have seen it. For the early Mormons, a cultural achievement was a spiritual achievement, and spiritual victories often found a cultural expression. It was Brigham Young, after all, who said, "If I were given the task of civilizing a people, I'd straightaway build a theater for the purpose." Well, in a sense, he was. And in a sense, he did.